Good afternoon, and welcome to this incredible event titled The Two Americas, the State of American Apartheid, the Consequences of Our Inaction and Our Acquiescence to a Racially Divided Society, featuring Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Richard Rothstein, Tiffani Flores, Dr. Stella Flores, and Sheryll Cashin. My name is Stefan Lallinger, and I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation, progressive think tank with a decades-long track record of studying the issue of racial and socioeconomic school integration in America, and the director of the Bridges Collaborative, a new national initiative for practitioners that focuses on school integration. This issue is intensely personal for me. My grandfather, Lewis L. Redding, was a lawyer from Delaware and the only Black graduate in his class of the Harvard Law School class of 1928. In 1954, he, alongside Thurgood Marshall and others, won the most celebrated court case in American history, Brown versus the Board of Education. And yet here we are, 6.5 decades later, living in a country where we don't bat an eye at the sight of segregated schools, segregated housing, and rampant discrimination based on race, class, or other identities. The purpose of this conversation today is to lay bare the devastating results and ongoing impact of our unwillingness to challenge racial segregation in our schools, our neighborhoods, our regions, and in the area of employment. We want to ask ourselves, what are the implications for a society that lives under these conditions? I can think of no more fitting conversation to have on the day our nation celebrates the homegoing of the legendary John Lewis, a humble man from Troy, Alabama, who spent his entire life and career fighting for these issues. The agenda for our next hour and 10 minutes. First, we'll begin with some opening remarks from the esteemed Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Then I'll introduce the panel, and we'll spend the last hour engaging in a dialogue with all of our panelists. Here to introduce our featured speaker is the former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and current professor of law and director for the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina, Professor Ted Shaw.
Thank you. I hope I'm unmuted, am I? Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor Shaw, we can hear you. You can continue.
Good,
thank you.
Good. Thank you. And Stefan, let me say, I wish I had a chance to see you in person. As a young lawyer, which means a long, long time ago, at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I did meet your father and did a little work with him. He was a cooperating attorney, as you know, for the Legal Defense Fund. So it's good to see you. They say that apples don't fall far from trees. I say they do roll sometimes, but apparently you haven't done much rolling. Glad to see you. I have the honor of introducing a dear and longtime friend, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. And we, in full disclosure, we went to college together. So, I have other friends on this panel, Richard Rothstein, and also Sheryll Cashin, Tiffani, and Stella. Good to see you all too. But Beverly Daniel Tatum and I, as I say, go way back. I remember in college, I said this to her a few weeks ago, we would sit in the cafeteria, and there would in fact be tables where Black students sat. And I remember somebody coming over one time, more than once, and saying, why are all the Black children, or students rather, at the same table? And I remember saying one time, well, why are all these tables full of white folk? Even then, I'm sure that Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum had her eye on this issue. And was conscious, and there was always something very thoughtful about her, very deliberate and careful in addressing issues of race. So I can't say I was terribly surprised when she eventually wrote her book um, um, by that title. And then, as I hope you all know, she had an anniversary edition come out. Was it last year or the year before that? But I have it on the shelf here in my study. This book has had a tremendous impact, as has she. And then, of course, being president of Spelman College, those of us who knew her and know her are proud of her for all kinds of reasons. But she's made an impact and is continuing to make an impact on our country. And she's one of the thought leaders when it comes to issues of race. And so we're very fortunate and grateful that she could spend some time with us today. I could go on and on about her, but I've already overstayed my welcome. I just want to say I introduce Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, friend, colleague, and one of our nation's thought leaders. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you, Ted. And I just want to say you took me back to Wesleyan University with your remarks. I appreciate being here and having that invitation. And certainly all of our Wesleyan friends are proud of you and the work that you've done all these years. So thank you for that warm introduction. And I'm very pleased and excited to be part of such a distinguished panel to talk about two Americas and what we might call American apartheid. It is remarkable in some ways that we are having this conversation 52 years after the release of the Kerner Commission report, and also 52 years after the publication of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King's book, his last book, titled Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And I want to reference that book in the opening of my remarks because I think we are at a moment in our society where that is the choice facing us, chaos or community. And how do we think about that with the current polarization that we're experiencing in our society? I want to start by providing a little context for that question by talking about the demographics of our society. I was born in 1954. We see that as a landmark date, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. But in 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everybody else. Not just 10% Black, 10% Black, Latinx, Asian, all of us, people of color together in an overwhelmingly white, 90% white nation. Fast forward to 2020, if you are under the age of 18 today, you are part of a population cohort that is only 52% white, 48% everybody else. We know that the Latinx population today is the largest population of color, approximately 18%. The Black population, approximately 13%. The Asian American population, 6%. Small, relatively speaking, to the others, but among the fastest growing population. And of course, we now count people in terms of their multiracial identity as well. In the 70s, that was just 1% of our population, but today, roughly 10% of babies born today are categorized as multiracial. So we have a society that has rapidly changed in its demographics, and we might talk about the fact that that rapid change is part of what is fueling the polarization in our society, because certainly it is causing a paradigm shift for white Americans to think about their nation not as a white majority nation, but a nation in which white people are a part of a pluralistic society. That is a shift. When we hear people talking about making America great again, using that Trump slogan, sometimes it gets translated into making America white again, which of course what perhaps a better description of how it was when Donald Trump was coming of age in the 50s. So we have this changing population, but as I like to say, new faces, same places. Despite the fact that the population is much more diverse, the school-age population is still highly segregated. Old patterns of segregation persist, most notably in schools and neighborhoods. More than 60 years after that Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, American schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980, as measured by the percentage of Black students who are attending schools that are 90 to 100% non-white, as they're referenced by the Department of Education. Nationwide, nearly 75% of Black students today attend so-called majority-minority schools. Similarly, approximately 80% of Latinx students attend schools where students of color are in the majority. Both Black and Latinx students are much more likely than white students to attend a school where 60% or more of their classmates are living in poverty. Separate remains unequal, as schools with concentrated poverty and racial segregation are still likely to have less experienced teachers, high levels of teacher turnover, inadequate facilities, and fewer classroom resources. Many people will ask me, well, why is that? Why is it that, 60 plus years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we've made such little progress? Those of you who know the legal history will know that there were key Supreme Court decisions between 1974 and 2007 that dramatically reduced the number of implementation methods available to communities engaged in school desegregation by eliminating strategies such as cross-district busing, dismantling local court supervision of desegregation plans, and limiting use of race-based admissions to ensure diversity in magnet school programs, for example. As these options for desegregation have been curtailed by court rulings, the number of intensely segregated schools with 0 to 10% white enrollment has more than tripled. Once again, students are typically assigned to schools based on their residence, where they live. And to the extent that neighborhoods are segregated, the schools remain so. Consequently, in 2020, young people growing up in racially divided communities are almost as separated from each other's daily lives as they were 52 years ago. According to a 2013 American Values Survey, which was conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, the social networks of white people in the United States are very homogeneous. Indeed, the researchers found that 75% of white adults have entirely white social networks without any presence of people of color, meaning not in their neighborhoods, not in their schools, at their workplaces. The consequence of that is that most white adults are not socially positioned to understand or even have accurate information about the experiences of people of color because they are not part of their social networks. We know that a lot of things have changed over the last 20 years since the first version of my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, came out in 1997, the new edition coming out in 2017. But one of the factors I want to mention in this current context is the dramatic rise in incarceration rates over the last 20 years, particularly for Black men. Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, has described the social impact of this new reality. And I want to mention it in the context of this discussion of American apartheid because, too, it also speaks to another way Black people have been isolated. More Black men are in prison today, according to Michelle Alexander's commentary, than at any other moment in our nation's history. She writes, more are disenfranchised today than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Young Black men today are maybe just as likely to suffer discrimination in employment, housing, public benefits, and jury service as a Black man in the Jim Crow era. discrimination that is perfectly legal because it's based on one's criminal record. This, she writes, is the new normal, the new racial equilibrium. The criminalization of the Black population contributes to what I am going to call, for the purpose of our conversation, the empathy gap. Because in the minds of many people, criminals do not deserve empathy. Dr. King, in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, talked about the fact that this empathy gap was at the heart of our inability to move toward a truly integrated society. He said laws can change, but until people really identify with the experience, until white people really identify with the experience of Black people, nothing substantive will be changed on a permanent basis. Because after every period of progress, there's pushback against progress. He describes that pushback in 1968. We can feel that pushback today in 2020. In order to push forward again, he says we have to bridge that empathy gap, which will come as a result of meaningful racial contact. Now, I want to just say one thing about that empathy gap, and then I will pause so that others will have a chance to be part of this conversation. But if we fast forward to the events of the last few weeks since the killing of George Floyd, what one might say is that we have experienced as a nation a moment of empathy. What do I mean by that? People are at home because of COVID-19, watching the news on their screens, seeing that horrible video of that man's murder, that Black man's murder by that police officer. And the anger and distress that many people have expressed, not just Black people, but white people, Latinx people, Asian people, a multiracial coalition of folks expressing distress and anger, rage about that, speaks to me a kind of empathy, a kind of recognition of his humanity being snuffed out in a way that we don't always see, and a kind of empathy that we didn't see in Ferguson, a kind of empathy that we didn't see in response to the Trayvon Martin killing, a kind of empathy that perhaps because we had to focus for that long period of time with such a clear shot of that murder happening in real time, awakened a kind of understanding that some people are really being mistreated by systems of oppression, that white supremacy is a real thing and really impacting in a way that when we talk about the numbers of school districts that are highly segregated or neighborhoods that persist in segregation have not created the same kind of awareness or empathy. I'm a psychologist. I think about things like empathy, but I think if we are to take advantage of this moment, we have to come back to the question of how we push forward. Do we choose chaos or community? Because the kind of two Americas we have at the moment is leading us down the road toward chaos unless we make a different choice. With that, I'm going to stop, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the program.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tatum, for sharing those powerful words and for helping us to really frame the issue at hand and what we're talking about today. And really thank you for bringing it to the present. We will certainly be spending a good portion of this conversation talking about what the implications of the events of the last few months on this particular issue are. So thank you so very much. And we'll be sure to make sure you are a large part of this conversation that we now turn to. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are available on the screen, but very briefly, we've got with us today Richard Rothstein, who is the author of The Color of Law and a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. We've got Tiffani Torres, an operations leader at Teens Take Charge, which is a youth advocacy group in New York City, and she's also a rising college freshman at Georgetown University. Sheryll Cashin is the author of Place Not Race and a professor of law, civil rights, and social justice at Georgetown University. And Dr. Stella Flores is the Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Diversity and an Associate Professor of Higher Education at NYU. I'm so excited to have such a tremendous and high-powered panel. In my experience, panels work best when we keep our answers concise and to the point so that we can bring in a wide diversity of opinions that we have on this stellar panel. And so to that end, my role will be to keep us moving. And so while acknowledging that that might appear a little awkward since we're all virtual, I'm thanking all of the panelists in advance for agreeing to share their airtime. Mr. Rothstein, I'm going to actually turn to you and start with you, sir. Many people today see segregation as a choice. They say birds of a feather just flock together, and whites just want to live among whites, and blacks have chosen to stay in urban areas or move to nearly all black neighborhoods and send their kids to all black and brown schools. So, we've heard about redlining in the past. Why is the segregation that we're seeing today not just an expression of the freedom of the choices that people have? And if it's not, what's wrong with people choosing to live amongst themselves anyway? Can you shed some light on that question, please?
Sure, Stefan, thank you. We have a widespread national myth. It's a rationalization we give ourselves. It's shared by blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners. The myth is that we have something we call de facto segregation. I use the term, I think many of us have used that term when we look at the patterns in every metropolitan area of the country. A de facto segregation is segregation that was created not just by people wanting to live with each other of the same race, as you said, but many people acknowledge that there was discrimination. They think it was all private. It was bigoted landlords or homeowners refusing to sell or rent to African Americans, or actors in the private economy like real estate agents or banks discriminating, or income differences. All of these individual personal decisions, bigoted, but nonetheless not governmental, is what created segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. Most of us think it's too bad to live in such a segregated society, but we don't feel any obligation to do anything about it. This is a very destructive myth, because if we understood the reality that the residential segregation in every metropolitan area was created by government policy and regulation, explicitly racial in intent, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. If we understood that history, we would have understood that the segregation that was imposed on this country was a constitutional violation. The federal government was doing it. It was a Fifth Amendment violation. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation. And if these are civil rights violations, every one of us as American citizens has an obligation to remedy it. So the myth is very, very destructive. It relieves us of responsibility to take action that we would have to assume as American citizens if we understood the unconstitutional nature of segregation. I don't have a lot of time right now to explain all the many policies the federal government followed. I'll just mention one, perhaps the most powerful, and that is in the post-World War II period. The federal government embarked on a program explicitly racial to move the white working class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs surrounding central cities in every metropolitan area of the country. We're all familiar with many of these suburbs. In every community in the country, they exist. The developers of these suburbs could never have assembled the capital to build as many as, in the case of Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. Westlake, south of San Francisco, 15,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to buy the land and build those kinds of homes? The only way those suburbs could have been developed was when Levitt and the other builders went to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, requested federal bank guarantees for their loans to buy the land and build the developments. And the federal agencies gave them those bank guarantees on condition that they sold no homes to African Americans. The FHA even required that they place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was a written policy in the federal underwriting manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend for federal bank guarantees. The applications of developers, the manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that would sell homes to African Americans. It went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white development that was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. I mean, this de facto notion is utter nonsense. It has no basis in reality whatsoever. Of course, there was private bigotry. Levitt was a bigot. If left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold homes to African Americans, but he wasn't left to his own devices. If the federal government had agreed to give him a bank guarantee on condition that he sell homes without discrimination, he would have had to do it. So the fact that there was private bigotry is not the explanation for our residential segregation. And let me say that this suburbanization policy, which is one of many, many policies that federal, state, and local governments followed to create segregation, the suburbanization policy is primarily responsible for the enormous wealth gap that exists today between African Americans and whites. African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that related to Jim Crow policies. But you'd think that people with 60% of the incomes of whites would be able to save and have wealth that's 60% of the wealth of whites. But in reality, although African Americans have incomes on average that are about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth.
And actually, the wealth gap is something that we're absolutely going to get into here in a minute. And so I really appreciate the framing, Mr. Rothstein. And I do want to say for our viewers, for those of you who have not read Mr. Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, he really lays out the case that he's making here in such a clear fashion about the ways in which the government at all levels has been complicit in creating the segregated society that we have today. So absolutely a must read for those who haven't read it. And Mr. Rothstein, we're going to get back to you in a second on some of those issues you brought up. Some of them are very pertinent to today. I'm going to turn for a moment to Tiffani Torres, who is with us from New York City. She's an activist with Teens Take Charge, which is really a tremendous group in New York City. They carry a really loud voice. I can tell you, I worked at the New York City Department of Education, and we were always interested in what Teens Take Charge was up to and what they were saying. So when they speak, people listen. And Tiffani has been a big part of that. So Tiffani, you recently graduated from high school. Congratulations. And in addition to your studies, you've been, among other things, chasing Mayor de Blasio around the city and demanding that he integrate New York City. So you can tell us a funny anecdote or two about that if you care. But first, talk to us a little bit about how you even got involved in this issue. Why is fighting segregation important to you and all of the other young people in New York City that you work with so closely?
Thank you for the introduction. I first heard of Teens Take Charge when I was in my junior year of high school, the beginning of my junior year. And I'm in this program called SEO Scholars, where the tagline is that they help get low-income students to and through college. So from the beginning or middle of my freshman year, we've been taking extra classes on Saturdays after school and during the summer. So over, I think, 720 hours by the end of our high school career, we'll have taken supplemental classes in English and math. And their whole purpose is to bridge the achievement and opportunity gap with students that go to majority low-income, majority students of color schools to more affluent students. And that was kind of like my first introduction to understanding this world of inequity and the inequality that exists in my education, because I come from an immigrant family. My parents came here in the 70s from the Dominican Republic, and I have always, they've always instilled in me the value of education, but I never understood that the education that I was receiving wasn't equal to my counterparts. I've always heard that whatever you do is on you, and it's up to you to make sure that the education that you're receiving is up to par, when in reality, that's not the truth, especially in New York City. And so it was one day during SEO where I heard about Teens Take Charge. I immediately joined. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And it's definitely been a journey, especially with Mr. de Blasio. Our first conversation was a lot nicer than our second conversation, which is on our website, if you guys want to listen to that, but I don't really want to get into it right now. Yeah, so I guess a little bit of...
Well, hold on. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. Can you tell us really quickly because I was in New York when this happened. Can you tell us just very briefly about calling into the radio show? I think folks would be interested in that.
Yeah, so I didn't think that they were going to put me through. I actually, like, before you get connected onto the show, you like speak to someone that's like screening all of the calls. And I had written a script right beforehand because I was nervous going in without a script, so I made sure that I had one. And I started to read it to the person that was screening the calls because I didn't realize that that was a process. And the whole thing was just confusing. But I remember, like, when I actually got onto the call, once I started, I couldn't necessarily stop. Like, I felt so driven by all of the experiences that I had and also all of the experiences of the students around me. And my school staff was, for the most part, really supportive. I remember I did not go to my math class that period. And I told my professor, like, I'm going to call into the show. I can't come to class. And then I like ran away before he could tell me that I couldn't do that. And it was an interesting call. I think the second one, he was very frustrated, which was obvious. When he said, I really think you're not listening to me or to us. And that was like the moment where I realized that the fight was never going to stop, especially if he was so frustrated by the work that we had been doing for just a few months.
So you all hear when I say when teens take charge talks, people listen. They find ways of making sure their voices are heard. Thank you so much for that, Tiffani. We'll be sure to come back to you on a couple of these issues. I want to turn to Dean Flores. Dean, you've also written about segregation among Black and Latinx children and its impact particularly on educational outcomes and college. What have you learned about the effects of segregation, not only on what some people call the education achievement gap, but on life outcomes in general, including things like college participation rates and attainment, earnings, wealth, and health? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to be with this distinguished panel. So I set this up as if I was, what are the three things I'd like to tell folks about the effects of segregation based on my research and the research of others. And so I'm going to call your attention to three themes in terms of what I think are some of the effects and consequences of racial segregation. And the first is the broken and unacknowledged chain of evidence on segregation from kindergarten to post-secondary education. I feel like there's this denial of evidence across the pipeline. We have evidence that in the early grades, there's definitely negative effects on achievement, on test scores, on the school experience when there's racial segregation. And I feel like the public accepts that to some extent. But as we move up the chain, there's this sudden denial that the role of race was ever part of our K through 12 system. And so what the break in the chain is what I call the magical land of race neutral higher education policy, in particular for financial aid. It's completely race neutral. We don't consider the role of racial inequality. We don't consider the history of how the government has, various government policies has deliberately segregated opportunities by race. And so then we come to this college land where apparently race is not supposed to matter. And then we jump into, for example, a place where race might be acknowledged in terms of our minority serving institutions. So you get some sense of, yes, we have HBCUs, we have Hispanic serving institutions, we have tribal colleges and universities, but there's no extra funding in terms of acknowledging all of the burdens and history that these institutions have to take on. Some are well-resourced and are doing amazing, and others are doing amazing with very little resources. And my research shows, mine and my colleagues, that in fact the college completion rate is the same at HBCUs and HSIs in Texas, for example, as similar institutions. But all we hear is a negative, on average, a negative perception of these institutions when they're actually doing a lot better for the resources that they have. And to that extent, then the third point I want to bring up has to do, I'm sorry, I'm on the second part is that we're a nation of constrained progress. So related to that, we have students that are doing well with very little resources, And we celebrate that instead of being deeply angry that we've cut off their human capital. How many students have we not allowed to do better, right? We should be angry that we have not given enough resources and we've basically cut off opportunity. So we need to flip that around instead of saying, oh, look at the grit that these students are showing, they're doing so well, instead of saying, how have we damaged the opportunities of these students? Students should not have to be superheroes because they're minorities. We're thinking about this in the wrong way. The other point I want to mention is that we've become a culture of funneling up disadvantage from early childhood to the labor market. We begin with segregation early in childhood, and then we move into high school. Then we move into college, where the colleges are segregated. You have more white students as a proportion of population in selective institutions than there are really white students to go around. There are more minority students as a share of population in non-selective institutions than there are minority students to go around. So it's a complete imbalance. Segregation is literally traveling from early childhood to post-secondary education. And it's also in the labor market, which I'll finish up with. So here's the story. If we think about racial segregation, it's not just in one sector. It's in schools, it's in colleges, it's in the banking system, it's tied to wealth. And if I were to name 3 mechanisms that I think are tied to racial segregation in education, the first one is home ownership. Mortgages and home ownership. Parents who can help their kids buy a home or help their kids inherit a home are going to inherit more wealth and be more likely to be better off. College tuition. Parents who can pay for college or other supplementary schooling for college are going to have children that are better well off. Parents who have high enough incomes that are reflected in their kids' test scores are actually going to receive more state and federal scholarships, even though they don't need it in terms of need. Our need-based aid has gone down, and we're giving more money to students with higher test scores, and we know who those students are. Finally, networking in the labor market. A surprising number, this is a study out of the Federal Reserve Bank, of white males got their jobs from their white male fathers into white-collar labor market areas. So between mortgages, college tuition, and networking in the labor market, we're basically recycling racial segregation. And what I want to bring out about that is that racial segregation is just not about housing and schools, it's in all these other sectors. And when we do one sector policies, we're really, we're not moving forward. It's not gonna make a dent in reducing racial inequality. And until we attack all these policies at once and come to terms with not only cumulative disadvantage, but cumulative advantage, and the effects of advantages across generation, and what that has done for people who have necessarily not earned it, and what that has done for individuals who never had a chance to even get there. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. You've given us a lot to think about. And Professor Cashin, I'm going to come to you, not specifically on that topic, although I'll come back to you on that topic. I know you have a lot of thoughts on higher education and selective admissions in particular, so we'll come back to that. I wanted to start with you about the fact that many people today talk about combating institutional or systemic racism and the need for things like reparations to compensate for slavery and Jim Crow. You have said we also need to look at things that exist today in terms of the policies, the structures, and the systems that oppress people. Can you talk about, just sort of elucidate for us, talk about what those systems are that you talk about, and why you've called, this is, I think people will find it interesting, why you've called the people who are living under segregation today the, quote, true descendants of slavery. So maybe shed light on the question first, and then you can tell us what you mean when you use that those terms.
I'll be frank, I'm working on a book that'll come out next year, in which I'm emphasizing that I so appreciate your work. Your work, Richard, makes my work easier. And what I'm kind of saying in this book is that the past is not past, right? That we constructed segregation, but state policy today, at all levels, government is basically investing in, maintaining, and reifying segregation, right? In fact, Trump makes this transparent. There's a silver lining. I mean, his tweet yesterday was a pro-segregation argument. Most of his public policies coming out of HUD support separate communities. All right, so my argument is that concentrated Black poverty, the iconic Black ghetto, is an intentional institution. The flip side of that is affluent white space. Both the public policies Richard talked about constructed both, and we've reified both. And there's serious distributional consequences today. And these institutions were animated by white supremacy. And so what I say is we tend to, there are 3 or 4 processes that are going on today. We have a caste system that's tied to geography. We overinvest in affluent white space, disinvest in poor Black space, and we tell lies about and mythologize the descendants. I call it the people trapped in iconic poor Black neighborhoods are the true descendants of slavery, to my mind. We tell lies and mythologize about the people in those neighborhoods to justify the way things are and mask the fact that there's a vacuum going on of, affluent white space, and the people who live there are getting way more than their fair share of public and private treasure, right? And again, the silver lining with Trump is he makes these things transparent. Just to emphasize that these processes are today, not the past. You look at every Black neighborhood that was redlined 80 years ago. Fully 3/4 of them are continuing to suffer to this day. There was a report from the Center for Investigative Reporting recently that said redlining persists, that is disinvestment, persists in 61 metro areas from Detroit, Philadelphia, Little Rock. And look at every dimension of public spending, particularly in schools. I can show you over-investing in white space, disinvesting in Black and brown space. And then the other thing that's very insidious is this dog whistling and the mythology about Black people, the stereotyping about Black people, with politicians for 50 years have been engaged in, and Trump is kind of revitalizing this rhetoric. All non-descendants participate in this stereotyping, right? Dr. Tatum talked about this. Part of the lack of empathy is, a lot of people believe these lies and participate in them. And that has a lot to do with why we can't seem to desegregate our neighborhoods or desegregate our schools. And the architecture of segregation, finally, the same people who are participating in this othering, they're being conscripted into the policing of Black bodies. So the stereotyping of Black people also leads to these awful situations like Amy Cooper calling the police on a Black birder, right? And the final thing I'll say is this segregation also facilitates a very different type of, what the state does is they disinvest in Black neighborhoods except when it comes to policing and incarceration, right? And so my argument, reparations has been, people are talking about that now. My argument is that reparation or repair must disrupt these processes, right? We have to repair what supremacy still breaks. And I am arguing that repair should begin in these iconic, poor Black neighborhoods. This book is for frankly, the children of the inner city, right? Not that I'm not very empathetic about how brown and Latinx people are also treated in other groups, but repair needs to begin there. And in the Q&A, if I can get into more about what I think repair would look like.
Great, thank you so much. So now I'm excited to do a little bit more rapid fire questioning here. And what I want to do is I want to actually take something, Mr. Rothstein, that you said, and I want to pose a question to both Mr. Rothstein and to Dr. Tatum, and others can jump in afterward if they want as well. So, Mr. Rothstein, you said very specifically in your opening statements that we don't feel any obligation to do anything about the segregated system that we live in, we as Americans. I want to take it because both you and Dr. Tatum have talked about the systemic level and the systemic nature of this problem, and I want to bring it to the level of the individual. And I want to take Dr. Tatum's exhortation at the beginning to say, let's orient ourselves towards action. So my question is very simply this. What does the ordinary American, what can they do about this issue? How should they be thinking about their role in this bigger problem that we have identified here? So Dr. Tatum, why don't I start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Rothstein on that question of what's the role of the individual today?
Sure. Well, I think that, thank you for the question. And I want to talk about a very concrete example, which I live in Atlanta. And I want to piggyback on something that Sheryll Cashin said, in terms of these neighborhoods, these iconic Black poor neighborhoods that were created by segregation. And certainly you can see that in Atlanta. And what we can each do depends on where we are and what our spheres of influence is. But I want to talk about that example because I serve on a board of an organization called the West Side Future Fund. The focus of the West Side Future Fund is to revitalize 4 historic African-American neighborhoods of the kind that were just described. The average family income is less than $30,000, more like $20,000. A lot of blight, This was a community in which Dr. King once lived, actually. Back in the 60s, his adult home with his wife, Coretta, and their children. At that time, it was a community of about 50,000 people in a city that was still highly segregated. Today, it's a community of about 15,000 people because as more opportunities opened up, Black people with resources moved out to other communities. But what's important about this community is that it sits on the edge of downtown Atlanta. And as people want to move, the millennials, white millennials and others want to move back into cities because they don't want to be, on highways all the time. The risk is gentrification displacing the historic Black residents of these neighborhoods. The neighborhood improves, but now it's an all-white neighborhood and the Black people have been driven out. So the question is, to come to your very specific question, what can individuals do? Well, what individuals are doing is leveraging the resources of their workplaces, the corporate entities, saying we need to make what was wrong right. We need to invest in these communities, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't displace the existing residents and create an environment, a holistic, healthy environment that hopefully will be a mixed income community. And maybe some white people will want to live there too. We don't know. But at the very least, we want it to be healthy for the folks who are there now. And we can do things like create an anti-displacement tax fund. So for those elderly Black residents who own their own homes, and there's about 8%, about 8% of them do, as the neighborhoods improve and taxes go up, they might be driven out. Can we engage the white philanthropic community and ordinary people who have resources to share to contribute to an anti-displacement tax fund, which will help preserve the tax rate currently for those elderly residents so that they don't have to choose between paying their taxes and keeping their home. That is in place. We have already implemented that as one example. So there are other things that we can do, but taking action requires doing an analysis of what's happening in my community and where can I intervene.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tatum. Mr. Rothstein, same question. What should an ordinary American do about this problem?
There's a great deal that we can do. We need a new civil rights movement in this country. We need a movement, as John Lewis said, that will engage in good trouble to make it uncomfortable to maintain these segregated patterns that we have. As Dr. Tatum said, the first challenge is that so many blacks and whites don't have ongoing social relationships with other race people, that coming together to create a civil rights movement that's both biracial and multi-ethnic is a challenge, but it can be done. It can be done. People can attend other race churches. They can find ways of approaching people that they work with who are other race, but whom they don't have social relationships with, and engaging in the beginnings of relationships with them. If we had a civil rights movement that was locally based of citizens, I'm not talking about organizations, I'm talking about local people, citizens who engage with others in civil rights activity in good trouble, perhaps the first thing they should do is insist that their schools teach the history of segregation accurately, history of slavery and Jim Crow and residential segregation, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we have, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been able to do. And the reality is that if people understand the history, they'll understand, I think, the obligation to do something about it. If they believe it happened by accident, they think it can unhappen by accident. So we should have campaigns in local communities to get school districts to stop lying about the history of slavery and Jim Crow. I've looked at the textbooks commonly used in American history courses across the country. All of them lie about this history. None of them mention the kinds of things I talked about before, which are well known and were well known in the past to Americans. I'm going to put in the chat room, actually, some curriculum resources that people can, there, I've done it, that citizens can do if they're organized in direct action groups to take actions in their local school districts. So that's one thing to begin to, and of course, if you start to get a conversation in schools taking place in a different and more accurate way, that conversation is going to leak out into the broader community as well. Another thing that a local civil rights group could do is it could address the local institutions that contributed to the segregation of that community. There's the banks, the real estate agencies, the developers, either they or their successors are still in existence today. Those groups that contributed to the segregation of those communities should be contributing, as was just said, to funds that subsidize the home ownership of African Americans, some in existing Black neighborhoods, some in communities from which African Americans have historically been excluded and that would have been affordable to them when they were created, but are now unaffordable. So local institutions, banks, real estate agents, developers who contributed to the segregation should be subsidizing its undoing.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is why it's so powerful for people to read your work, read Dr. Tatum's work. If we don't know the history of who's contributed to this, then it's hard for us to take action now. And so I think that's an incredibly powerful statement. The reason I'm wanting to harp on this a little bit, this notion of what the individual can do, is because we're in a moment now where a lot of people have said, as a result of George Floyd and the protests that are happening, this time is different. And I want to stand up and I want to do something as an ordinary citizen. And the question for them then becomes, well, what do I do? And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure we lay out for people exactly what the concrete things are for them to be able to do in order to push this conversation forward. Tiffani, I'm going to come to you and I want to stick on this sort of same theme of like, what can individuals do? Let's say, for example, you're in New York City and you're a student who comes from a privileged background. You go to one of the specialized high schools that's highly segregated in New York City. What should you do? Should you not go to that school? Should you protest in other ways? What's the role of an individual student who wants to be part of a solution here? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I want to highlight something that Stella said earlier, that students shouldn't have to be superheroes because they're minorities. I think that what's very harmful is when people view this idea of like fighting for equity and fighting for equality as our job, as this people who are experiencing these inequities as a result of their own privilege, that it's our duty to fight for us. And it is, but it's not just our job, because this people, and especially the students who are in this position of privilege, are the reason why we have to fight this fight in the first place. And so I think Teens Take Charge was my first, in all 4 or 5 of the schools that I've attended throughout my life, Teens Take Charge was the space where I experienced the most diversity. I ever seen students from so many different backgrounds. Like I hadn't had so many conversations with another white student than I have in Teens Take Charge. And that kind of showed to me that like it's not our responsibility to fight for something that was set up against us. And especially just for people who claim that Black Lives Matter, for people that have Black Lives Matter in their bio, who posted a Black square on Instagram. Like it's their responsibility not only to talk the talk, but also to fight the fight. Because at the end of the day, we can't be expected to hold the burden that we're facing every single day and also be the only ones that have to change it.
Thank you for that incredibly powerful answer. I want to stick on this theme, and Dr. Flores, Professor Cashin, I want you to get in specifically, a fear that a lot of people had after the George Floyd protests was that this would all dissipate and people would get distracted again, go back to social media, whatever it is that they were doing before. And I think we've seen a little bit of evidence of, the energy has gone down a little bit. So what is different about this moment, if anything, in relation to this broader issue that we are trying to fight of segregation in our housing and in our schools? Is there anything different? Should we feel hopeful about this particular moment?
I don't know about different. I think so. Right, in this line of work, you learn to expect the worst, and so prepare for the worst, right? What I see different is these corporate forces that are now, whether they're window dressing or not, with their black squares and whatever. I think we take advantage of that and keep reminding them that they made a commitment to that. I think we need more sectors involved in this other than just education and the civil rights people. The other thing I think we need to do is really understand what it means to be anti-racist and to understand using anti-racist education to dismantle racial inequality. And so, I took this moment, for example, at NYU to propose a plan that said, guess what? We have racism at every level of the university, from where we go and recruit in junior high to the board of trustees. And it is our responsibility to understand how there is privilege and disadvantage at each level. And it is our responsibility to understand that it goes beyond the individual action. These are structural issues, as we all can acknowledge probably here on this panel, but the everyday person does not understand the structural issues built into why we have racial inequality. And I think we all, need, I think the textbook example is very interesting, coming from Texas, where I learned that, Mexicans are bad in a room full of Mexican kids. I mean, it's gotten better, but, we need to understand how to propel better research and better education to our students from the very beginning, but also to our teacher education programs, to our principals, to our professors teaching all kinds of students. So it has to be a full cast, comprehensive educational campaign. And I think the corporate people should pay for it.
Professor Cashin, do you want to get in on this question?
A couple things, answering both the most recent question and the one before it about what individuals could do. I do think this time is different. Just looking at the number of white people, I mean, I've seen it in my own city of Washington, D.C., putting up the signs, Black Lives Matter. And, but what I'll say is, even before George Floyd's execution, if I can use that word, there was a word I was hearing a lot with nonprofits and local governments, and it was equity. And there has been a groundswell of efforts at the local level to force governments to conduct an equity analysis and really understand in hardcore, concrete terms where they're investing money and trying to reallocate them. And after George Floyd was assassinated, you've seen, there's the whole defund movement, right? You have seen some cities moving fast on some policies, right? Reallocating some resources from policing. There's debates going on in every major town in this country about where resources should be going. That is new and real and important. I think for individuals, obviously you should register to vote and be involved in electing people who believe in equity and who believe in inclusion, who believe Black Lives Matter and are willing to fight for a different allocation of resources. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? I do think we are in a bit of a civil rights movement, and I would say find the organization on the ground that already has a multiracial coalition that's fighting on whatever your priority issue is, whether it's decarceration or defunding or school integration. Particularly in the faith community, there are a lot of organizations that are out there doing that work. And I'd say just join up and get, bring your voice to it.
Great, thank you for that. I want to, and this will actually be for the whole panel. I want to ask the question, a lot of us have put out things that people can do, but my question is, we are, and I opened with this, we're 66 years after Brown versus Board. We're decades after the Kerner Commission. So all of these things that we could do, why haven't they happened? Why are we still living with this issue? So that's the question I want to ask, and maybe I'll start back up at the top. Dr. Tatum, do you have thoughts on this in particular?
Yes. So I want to come back to where I started, which was that quote, the title of King's book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And what I mean by going back there is that there is an individual choice that each of us can make in the ways that we are just hearing, not only in terms of who we vote for, what organizations we get involved in, what kinds of changes we advocate for in our community, but in any moment, we are choosing something that's going to lead to a more inclusive community or one that is more chaos driven. And we hear in the tweets of our current president, for example, his push toward a past that was exclusionary. We can see the possibility of pushing forward toward a more inclusive future. And that, I think, is a choice that we are constantly making. Is where I'm giving my money today, are the people I'm talking to today, are the letters I'm writing today, are the books I'm reading to educate myself today, helping me think more inclusively or leading me toward a past. And in that book, where all the blankets, that's mine. where do we go from here? In that book, Dr. King says, after every period of racial progress, there's a push back against that progress. Carol Anderson wrote a book called White Rage. She describes the same process. Periods of forward movement push back against Black progress. And so we have experienced, I think, in the last 20 years, push back against progress. The election of Barack Obama notwithstanding, push back against progress. And yet today, I think the George Floyd moment that we're talking about is a moment that allows us to mobilize and push ahead again. And that's a choice each of us can make.
Great, same question. Richard, going to come to you, and then Tiffany going to go to you on that same question.
Well, I think the reason that we haven't progressed since the Kerner Commission report, since Brown versus Board of Education is, as I indicated earlier, the civil rights movement faded, went away. Too many, I'm going to quote a mentor of mine who, he knows who I'm talking about. Too many of the most dedicated, passionate young people, Black and white, decided that the way to make social change is to become lawyers like Thurgood Marshall. And the experience of activism has gone away. And this can't be done with think tanks, can't be done with litigation. Of course, litigation is going to be necessary to defend progress that we made, but we can't initiate it with litigation for which there's no public support. the spirit of activism that motivated the civil rights movement of the 1960s somehow has to return. I am very, very encouraged, as I think everybody else is, by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They were biracial, multi-ethnic. That's essential. African Americans don't have the political power to accomplish this on their own, but whites can't lead and tell African Americans how they should live. So it has to be a biracial movement. And it has to be something that people do as citizens, not as PhDs, not as lawyers. Of course, they all have roles to play, but we know what the policies to redress segregation are. It's the political mobilization.
Great. Well, Richard, I work at a think tank, but I'm not going to take that personally, which is.
Feel free.
Tiffani, hop in on this same question, please.
Yeah, I wanted to address two things. The first thing being just how inequitable the school system is in New York City. Like, we operate under a system of open choice when in reality we have admission screens that make that not true, especially for students of color. And specifically in District 2, we have people like Maud Marin, who's on the District 2 Community Education Council, spreading harmful ideas about communities of color and aiding in the participation of the school to prison pipeline and the disproportionate policing in schools that are majority students of color, and also spreading this idea that even if a parent's views are racist, they need to be listened to and they need to be heard and taken as a valid concern. When in reality, that's the reason that we're still in this situation in the first place. And when you think about George Floyd and all of these victims of police brutality, all of these victims have gone to segregated schools, and all of these police officers have also gone to segregated schools. So when you really put that into context, it has to be a byproduct of segregation that persists, that we keep allowing to persist year after year. And another thing is, how come we only started talking about students in temporary housing and students that don't have access to Wi-Fi after the pandemic happened? Because the Department of Education was completely fine with that happening when they knew it was happening, when, sorry, they were completely fine with that happening before the pandemic started. Over 300,000 iPads were distributed, and students are expected to type essays and complete all of their coursework on these iPads. That isn't necessarily the best way to do so. And yet they're still expected to go on their day-to-day lives without addressing mental health, without addressing a lot of the issues that come with being a first generation or low-income student in New York City. And they're just expected to go about their day-to-day lives. And I guess my final point will be that when we start to believe, when the Department of Education starts to believe, when Maud Marin and her supporters start to believe in the humanity of students of color, then we'll be able to progress. But as of right now, it's not really looking that way.
You just brought up a number of really great points in a very short span there, Tiffani. There's a lot to get to. Thank you for that. Let me actually, so I want to make sure, I promised that I'd get some audience Q&A questions. And so I have one from the audience that I'd actually like to ask you, Professor Cashin, and that is an audience member who participated in the last panel said the last panel was a lot about the importance of broad multiracial power and Black leadership. And they want to know, it's a two-part question, Professor Cashin, how much power will it take to change the kind of structures we're talking about? And part two of that question is, who is benefiting from segregation as it stands right now, and what's at stake for those people who are benefiting from the system?
Two great questions. Well, depending on what the specific issue is, taking Tiffany's experience, Bill de Blasio has a lot of power to influence school integration just with mayoral powers, right? And so it takes only 51% to vote into office the person who's going to support the policies you want, right? So how, Black people are not 51% in many places anymore. They're not 51% in DC anymore, right? The reality is, in most situations, whether you're advocating for Black or brown or Asian or, struggling whites, you need a multiracial coalition. But all you need to, now with the Electoral College, you might need to be 56, 57, 58%, right? But the beauty of the math is that with each new generation, right? Each new generation is more diverse than the one before it. Younger people are better than their grandparents in terms of their openness to diversity and their empathy, at least in theory, for people who are different. And I don't say this with joy, but as older whites and their generation dies off, older whites grew up in this country, as Dr. Tatum pointed out, expecting to be dominant, expecting to be overwhelmingly dominant, right? So we are going to reach a tipping point, particularly with the sleeping giant of American politics, when Latinx people, young people, most Latinx people in this country are citizens, when they begin to register to vote and vote in numbers equal to what whites and Blacks do, it's going to be easier to get to a multiracial coalition that commands a solid majority, right? But you don't have to wait for that to happen. On the ground where you are, you can gather that power, tap the people you think should be running for office, get together behind them, right? So that's multiracial power. It's also Black power, if your coalition sees Black people in a humanized way. The second point, which is, gets to Tiffany's point and the question about why 66 years after Kerner or whatever the number of years we're still segregated. A lot of people benefit from being from segregation. They benefit in a parochial, narrow sense, right? If you're in affluent white space, overwhelmingly white, poverty-free space, things are pretty good for you, right? You get the best of everything except for traffic, right? You get more amenities. This country spends about $23 billion a year more in majority white affluent schools than they do in high poverty Black and brown schools. So in a parochial sense, it works for you. You get great teachers, lower teacher student ratios, more AP classes, all of that, right? And affluent people in affluent space, opportunity hoards and doesn't share. They like this system just the way it is, and they are not going to volunteer to dismantle it. Power concedes nothing without a demand. You need that multiracial coalition that gets in there to actively try to dismantle.
Well, it's almost as if you're advertising for our next panel here, which is who benefits from this system. So that was a tremendously powerful answer. Look, panel, this has been fantastic. We're at time. I have a challenge for you, and the challenge is this. I'm going to ask you one last question, but you get to answer it in only 2 sentences. All right, and the first sentence is either going to be yes or no. So here's the question, just to give you a second to think about it. Are you hopeful for the future? Do you think that we will live in an integrated and inclusive in communities and schools in our lifetime? So the question is, are you hopeful for the future on this issue? So yes or no, and then give me a 1-sentence reason why you either are or you are not hopeful. See who can follow the rules here. All right, you got 30 seconds of think time. Dr. Flores, get ready. I'm going to start with you. Are you hopeful, yes or no, and then why? And then I'll lead us around the circle from there and then close us out. Dr. Flores, hopeful, yes or no, and why?
Yes. Because if we don't diversify and integrate, we're going to economically disintegrate.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. Rhyming wasn't a condition, but you managed to do it. That was really great. Let's go to Dr. Tatum. Yes or no, hopeful, why or why not?
Yes, because injustice prevails when hopelessness persists. That is a quote from Bryan Stevenson. And hope is a discipline. So I am required to be hopeful. Otherwise, I wouldn't get up in the morning. Change is possible. We all have to be working toward it. and hope is necessary.
Beautiful. Thank you. Richard, hopeful yes or no, why or why not?
Well, Stefan, it depends on whose lifetime you're talking about. I'm hopeful that we'll have an integrated society in your lifetime. I don't have such expectations for mine, but I think that because we have such a broader understanding today, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had in American history. Out of that, I think a new civil rights movement can emerge that can accomplish much more than we've accomplished in the past. So I'm hopeful, not confident, but hopeful.
Great. Tiffani, you got the longest lifetime of all of us ahead of you. Yes or no, why or why not?
It's a little loud in my background. Do you guys hear me well?
Yes, proceed. You're good.
I was going to say I'm hopeful because I believe in the humanity of my Black and brown peers, and to lose hope is to stop living.
Thank you. And then looks like you got the last word, Professor Cashin. Hopeful yes or no, why or why not?
I'm hopeful because hope is a choice. But also, as I said before, the demographics are in our favor. And we're in this moment where people are waking up. I think the majority of people today reject this mean-spirited, awful politics of division and want something better, saner, and more humane. So we just have to keep fighting.
Thank you so much. And with that, thank you to all of our panelists. What a wonderful discussion. Such a beautiful diversity of opinions, multi-generational, multiracial. I think it's a model for the type of coalition needed to move this issue forward in the future. So if we were in a room, you'd all be getting a standing ovation and large applause, but we're all in our own living room. So we'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to turn it over to one of the organizers of this event, Yolanda. Yolanda Melville, we're going to turn it over to you to let us know some logistics. Thank you all very much for participating.
Sure. Thank you again, everyone. It was a fascinating and very informative panel. Stefan, do not leave yet because I think you have to tee us up for the next set of panels coming up tomorrow. But I'm here to invite everyone to our evening award ceremony. So please join us from 6:15 p.m. to 7:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the Summit for Civil Rights Welcome Reception and Award Ceremony. We will honor Elizabeth Powell, Councilwoman Davita Russell, and Attorney General Keith Ellison. Our honorees will receive the Shirley Chisholm and Jim Clyburn Leadership Awards. The ceremony is co-hosted by myself and Carmen Blakely, aka DJ Carmen Spindiego. Access to this event is just a little bit different than we've had in the past panels. Please watch the award ceremony through our YouTube link, which you should have been provided in your programming. We will see you very shortly. Again, thank you to our panel. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to everyone watching. Stefan, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. All right, last thing I'm going to say, I promise, and then folks can get out of here. So tomorrow there are 3 fantastic discussions. This has really been a power-packed set of individuals here at the summit. So tomorrow, the first panel is called Who's Profiting? That will begin at 10. The featured speaker there is Kianga Yamada Taylor. Next at 12:15, the second panel is America Ready for a Second Reconstruction, a Third Founding? The featured speakers there are Eric Foner and Barbara Ransby. And then finally at 2 o'clock, the last session before the closing remarks is What is to be done? How can we help? Featured speaker there is Richard Trumpka. So again, fascinating, power-packed panel of folks tomorrow. That's all we have. We'll close it out here. One more thanks to our panel, and we hope to see you all at the reception tonight. Thank you.